Hey everybody. A few quick notes before starting today's episode. Firstly, this week's 5-star review, written by Kayla, titled Absolutely Love. Kayla writes, I'm in love with this series. I started listening 2 days ago at work and I immediately showed my boyfriend and now we're both hooked. Thank you so much for the amazing content you share. Thanks, Kayla. The second thing on the list is an email that I received from an anonymous listener, which reflects my hopes for Psychotropic, which are, in short, to have you, the listener, listen to these stories and use them to reflect on your own life and your own experiences. This email refers to the previous episode released, titled The Gremlin, which revolves around a lady's story about how her husband spiked her drink with LSD without her knowing. Something that I believe most of us would agree is a pretty horrendous thing. This email reads, The Gremlins podcast was pretty powerful. Pretty crazy that lady's husband dosed her without her knowledge. Kind of made me think of a rape situation. Not that I've ever done either of those things, but the podcast left me pondering situations where I may have been overly aggressive in pushing my wife or others out of their comfort zone and how that could have made them feel. Once again, I really enjoy how your podcasts reflect all sides of drug use and impacts on bystanders. Good stuff, Phillip. Thank you so much for that email. If you're interested in writing in and sharing an opinion or a story or just thoughts you have about any episode that you've listened to so far, you can reach me via psychotropicpodcast.com. The last thing on the list is in regards to the episode you're about to hear. The subject of today's episode is the host of another podcast called Nodsquad. This podcast also features drug-centric material. Only the view is from a much more immediate perspective. I myself am a regular listener of this podcast, and I highly recommend it. I was actually given the opportunity to be featured on episode 29 of Nod Squad. So, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about me and some of my history and perspective regarding drug use, definitely go check it out. Again, episode 29 of Nod Squad. Having said all that, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you find it valuable, be sure to write in. Tell me what you think. Also, leave a review. Thanks again, everybody. Happy listening.
This is my first time ever being an inpatient or giving it a try. I've done every court-ordered drug program that they could possibly give you in California. So, and for the most part, I've passed all them with flying colors. But it seemed like every time I'd grab that certification of completion, I would just go. I was not at all serious or willing to accept that I had an issue until now. So now it's like, okay, my back's up against the wall. I got nowhere else to go. And it's like, I have to actually change. And it's kind of, it's a really uncomfortable feeling, but I guess that's what's needed for change and growth, you know? I've been in inpatient for like 75 days, roughly. And it's like, I can already tell I haven't even begun to scratch the surface of like my self-reflection and introspection. And it's like, I've realized I have a lot of deep-seated, like rooted issues I need to work on myself, because I still find myself like slipping back into character defects here and there, but at least now I catch myself doing it.
Psychotropic presents Brian.
I'm already on step 9, making my amends, and step 4 and step 9 for me were incredibly uncomfortable. It's like I literally had to accept the fact that I'm pretty much responsible for where my life has led me, and a lot of that was based on my mental perception and emotional outgoing that led to my decision making, and that kind of just shaped the physical world around me. So, I mean, that was kind of a tough pill to swallow, even though I kind of already knew that. It was like, oh, okay, well, even the things that happened to me that I tried to play the victim about in situations, it was still my fault for how I handled things that were thrown at me. As far back as I can remember, even before I started taking drugs, I was always kind of controlled and manipulated by fear, and I've always had a defiant nature, and was drawn to kind of the rebellious crowd. I think a lot of my drug use kind of spawned back to when I was growing up and living in Los Angeles. I remember being exposed to a lot of things that a child at that age probably shouldn't, or definitely shouldn't be exposed to. I saw my first dead body when I was 6 years old, and I remember seeing I'm assuming there was a bunch of gang members drive up and stuff a body that into a trash can right across from our street, and even though I didn't know it, I was subconsciously letting a lot of fears do my decision making for me. I think it was around 1991. It was a year before the LA riots. My parents had moved us out of Los Angeles up into San Luis Obispo County. And around 4th grade, I started magnetizing towards a crowd of friends that would eventually become known as, like, the potheads and whatnot. And even though all my friends were using drugs around me, I was still very scared to experiment with them. And it was about age 16 I started smoking pot for the first time and drinking alcohol. And I think back then, because of the black market nature of having to go about purchasing weed, I was then exposed to more harmful substances. But I would say a lot of my drug use stemmed when I first took my my first pain pill. I remember taking Norcos, like the strong, heavy Vicodins, and it was almost, I guess, like, it's kind of cliche, but it was like there was a revolution in my brain where I was like, oh, I want to feel like this all the time. I felt more confident. I was more outgoing and social with people. It had a very opposite reaction to what normal people probably would feel when taking an opiate. I would instead of being drowsy and falling asleep, it gave me incredible amounts of energy and motivation. So I would always use opiates to get a lot of things done. I was in a lot of bands, and I was I kind of fooled myself into thinking that it sparked my creative process and songwriting. And I was, I'd be cleaning my room, almost like how someone would do a stimulant. And so I was popping a lot of pills throughout high school. And I think it was like right around when I had graduated high school in around 2002, Oxycontin had just hit the States. Back then, it wasn't known as hillbilly heroin. It was just known as Oxycontin. And I will never forget the first time I snorted, like, it was probably like a 40 milligram Oxycontin. It felt like I had taken a handful of Vicodin. So in my mind, I was like, instead of having to buy handfuls of Vicodin, I can buy one pill, snort half or all of it, and it would get the same effect. So then I was instantly drawn towards towards that. The problem is that there was such a high demand, and they were still kind of difficult to get even back then, because everyone wanted to buy them. That kind of kept my addiction at bay, because it never allowed me to get fully strung out enough to where I'd get heavy withdrawals. And also I was also intermingling with other drugs. I was taking ecstasy, I was snorting cocaine. All those drugs were okay, but I was always like number one drawn to opiates as my go-to drug. And so, and heavy weed smoking, drinking. I was drinking a lot of alcohol, but I think by the time I'd hit 21, I think it had less of an attraction for me. And I was incredibly romanticized over black market illegal drugs. There was something that felt rebellious and cool about, breaking laws. What really led my addiction to take a turn for the worst is when I had moved back to LA. I was doing some community college and kind of floating around up in the central coast of California and not really knowing what to do with my life. But I've always was heavily into music and sound engineering. So I had moved back to LA and Hollywood to attend a Musicians Institute for their sound engineering certification. And about 2 quarters or 2 semesters into attending there and living in Hollywood and, playing shows and just being totally immersed in the music industry down there, I had gotten diagnosed with testicular cancer. It totally turned my life upside down. I had to drop out of school. I had to go in and get rushed in for immediate surgery. My girlfriend had broken up with me, and my insane D-list actor roommate had kicked me out. And so I was just kind of laying in the hospital bed, just distraught and not knowing where my life was going to turn. And post-surgery, they had put in liquid Dilaudid into my IV in a Y valve, and just it was kind of like the closest thing to intravenous use I had known at the time. It made all my insecurities and all my fears just wash away. They kind of say it's like a warm blanket or being hugged by an angel. For me, it was like someone had poured a glass of water over my body, and I just felt the high kind of rush through as it kind of coursed through my veins. And by the time I had been allowed to check out of the hospital, I was off with a bottle of pain pills in my hand and off and running. So that was basically my solution was opiates, mainly Oxycontin, but also Dilaudid and morphine, anything I could get my hands on. Around that time, I was being seen by oncologists and urologists, and I was not knowing how bad my health was, because it's like, when you're 24 years old and you're dealt the heavy blow that you have cancer, I thought I had maybe 1 to 3 years to live. So I basically made the commitment to myself where it's like, okay, well, if my time on this earth is limited and I may not, my cancer may come back, because I saw what happened to my grandparents or my grandmother when she had cancer, and it wrecked her. So I was like, I'm going to do and live however I feel I want to, and live as free as possible until my time comes. So I started researching more about eating healthier and maintaining a diet and a exercise regimen that kind of would help me get through the whole process of post-surgery for cancer. Because the MRI scan, I saw there's no cancer cells that they could find in my body. So I thought, well, I'll do whatever I can other than chemo to keep myself as safe as possible. And that's when I discovered Rick Simpson oil, which is basically a concentrated cannabis oil. And Rick Simpson, I think he was living in Nova Scotia, Canada at the time, and treating terminally ill cancer patients with his concentrated cannabis oil, which had been shown to kill cancer cells in itself. So I started ingesting cannabis oil twice a day on a basic regimen, and I don't know if that has anything to do with my remission or anything, but I've been, cancer free for about 11 years since I've had surgery. And then from there, I became heavily immersed in like a pro cannabis kind of activist lifestyle. I got hired by a dispensary in Pasadena and started out as a delivery driver. Back then, during the era of Proposition 215, there in Pasadena City, there were no storefront dispensaries allowed in those city limits. So what was allowed were delivery services. So basically, what would happen is we would get calls for orders or inquiries about what good strains we had. They would make an order, and we would text said order to our drivers, and they would deliver it to like residents. So I started doing deliveries and kind of worked my way up to running the phone lines, being a manager of a storefront in Venice Beach, and the manager of 2 delivery locations, one in Pasadena and one in Redondo Beach. And I did that for almost 5 years, just being all over the cannabis industry. Basically, I was also growing medical marijuana at any and every apartment I had in Los Angeles. And eventually I was overseeing like 1,000 plant grow operation in this what used to be, I guess, a lumber mill. We ended up gutting the inside of the building, stealing the power, having my electrician friends go around the meter of this phase 3 powered industrial building and just building little grow huts inside. And it was an insane amount of work, but I also made an insane amount of money at the time. So, I mean, mostly around $5,000 a month I was making, but I was working 7 days a week. What was good about that job too is that, for the most part, as long as I had all my cell phones on me, I could go anywhere I wanted to, as long as I could take calls and send orders to my drivers. So, I went from kind of having nothing to having access to all this money, and I was also DJing at local venues all around LA. So my whole day during the daytime consisted of working for the dispensary, going and overseeing grow operation, and then playing concerts at night. And during that time, I had run into, I'd run into people who could get me pain pills here and there. And then I worked my way up that kind of food chain ladder and met someone who had always had OxyContin at all times. So I was able to get, usually like 5 80 milligram OxyContins for $100, $20 each basically, which at the time was a great deal because some people would charge $1 a milligram, and $80 for an $80 milligram OxyContin I thought was absurd and outrageous. So to be able to get that, or you would even get the older OxyContins, the ones where you could rub the coating off of, and you can either snort or inject or smoke or do however you pleased. And those were $25 each. So usually, I mean, I was so overworked and I already had kind of built it into the muscle memory of my brain that I would benefit from opiates because it would make me more productive, it'd make me more focused and motivated to get all this work done, as well as pursue, my hobbies and interests during the nighttime. So by that time my tolerance for OxyContin went through the roof. I every couple or 2 or 3 days I'd be buying 5 80 milligram oxys. Some days I would just take 2 or 3. Some days I would take 4 or 5 80 milligram oxys until it got to the point where I would have to, literally pop a couple oxys and wait for them to kick in before I could even get out of bed, just because I would wake up so sick and lethargic. Around that time, I had gotten pulled over with my girlfriend coming back into town from the holidays, and I had a warrant out for my arrest. I had a failure to appear for like a shoplifting ticket I got. They had cited and released me because I used to, before I'd gotten that job, I was shoplifting groceries or just whatever. And I missed the court date, so there was a warrant out for my arrest, and the police officers had searched through my car, and in my trunk I had just a trunk full of inventory for the dispensary, flour, concentrates, edibles, pretty much all these different things. And back then there was a real gray area of what was allowed and not allowed for these licensed dispensaries to do. And one particular gray area were concentrates, or what's known as dabs now, because most of the concentrates, especially back then, were extracted with butane. It's called BHO, or butane hash extraction. And there was a lot of incidences where people were using butane to extract THC out of the plant matter of marijuana, and the ventilation systems around them were just not adequate enough to exhaust the butane that was in the air. Oh, I'm sorry, I need to turn that off. So basically, there were a lot of teenagers who were making YouTube videos trying to show off like their butane hash extraction or whatnot, and blowing up their own houses, literally. Where there was just massive explosions happening all over California because of these butane hash labs, like makeshift ones. And I remember back then, if you had gotten caught with a butane hash lab, it was the same charge as a meth lab because it was so serious. There were so many incidences going off all over. We had even bought an edible company where the previous owner had blown up his house and had third-degree burns all over his body. So because I had all these concentrates in separate containers, I had gotten charged with felony intent to distribute of, medicinal marijuana. I had caught in one charge, been put on probation for 3 years, and then I ended up getting pulled over again on my way driving to my Oxy dealer's house. I'd gotten pulled over. They'd found a joint. They had found 3 cell phones. And in my center console, there was like $1,000 in all these different bills. So they had forced me to unlock my phones, and then they see all these text messages to various drivers. And they think they've caught it, just this big drug dealer. And they made me sign a clause allowing them to raid my own house. And they just stormed through my little bungalow apartment in Pasadena and had taken all, $10,000+ in various envelopes, all this inventory and weed and whatever they could find. And I ended up bailing myself out of jail, going back to my apartment, which is just trashed at this point, knowing I'm going to be sick because by then I'm just consuming so many opiates. Fortunately, they hadn't found whatever little stash of Oxy I had left, and I ended up tapering down my tolerance for that and doing an at-home detox and getting clean for a short period of time. I had gotten back in touch with an ex-girlfriend who was using heroin pretty heavily. She was living in Indiana. So I kind of was clean. I wasn't really practicing NA or AA or the 12 steps, but I had thought, well, I detoxed myself. I kind of have a handle on this, and convinced her to fly out and I would help get her well the way I got myself well, which kind of turned out to be a complete disaster. She came out and smuggled like a large amount of morphine and other various pills to try and help her taper off of heroin. And for a few days that worked, but she definitely was sick. And I remember we were driving down Sunset Boulevard, and she had convinced me to help her find heroin. She did whatever she could, manipulate me or bribe me or whatever she could. And finally she bribed me with enough things because she had a heavy trust fund. So I caved, and we went and got heroin. I had tried heroin a few times before, but I somehow justified my drug use because I was like, well, okay, well, I'm not using heroin. I'm just using Oxy. It's like in some weird fucked up way, I convinced myself, well, this is classier. This is not as bad. And then as soon as I injected heroin on that night, it was just yet another revolution where I'm like, okay, this feels amazing. I got the instant rush. I didn't have to wait however long it would take for it to kick in. And I just went and hit the ground running from there. We ended up just becoming immediate junkies, and I was running around downtown LA with her every day, if not every other day, and scoring heroin, because by that point I was in and out of courts trying to fight these 2 felony intent to distribute charges, and that was just taking forever. I was trying to do community service to appease the judge, and it was kind of a losing battle at that point, and I had known it, so I was really just doing nothing all day, kind of sitting on what little amount of money I had stashed away from what I had made for the dispensaries and her trust fund, and we were just kind of being just lazy junkies, and we were just living on what funds we had. And just our main objective was scoring heroin and doing heroin. From there, it evolved into any kind of intravenous use, mostly cocaine and heroin. Later on, it became, methamphetamine and heroin, and any other kind of substance I could put in a needle and inject into my body. I've injected MDMA, but it was mainly what evolved towards the end was methamphetamine and heroin. I eventually moved back up into the Central Coast with my parents, smuggling my girlfriend with me and hiding her in my room, and joining a methadone program, getting off of heroin for a short period of time, and preparing myself for jail because I knew it was going to happen. I had caught in a heroin charge up in San Luis Obispo while still battling my court case, and I knew that wasn't going to look good to the district attorney or judge. And I finally caved and agreed to what would end up being a 180-day sentence. Out of those 180 days, I served 65 days in LA County Jail because of being a first-timer in jail. I was a trustee, so that lowered my sentence. And I was also, the jail there was so full at the time, they were giving early kicks. So I did my 65 days, which was a very, very different experience. I'm used to growing up in suburban neighborhoods and this and that. And now I'm kind of in this criminal college where people are teaching me all these different scams, counterfeiting money, identity theft, fake credit cards, and so I kind of got out of there just worse off than when I went in, because now I knew how to break more laws and make more money in more riskier and shady situations. From there, I would do nothing but date other addicts and start these kind of Sid and Nancy, Kurt and Courtney relationships, and just it became one relapse after another, where I would get busted for a possession charge. The court in San Luis Obispo would order me a drug program. First it was PC 1000, which is like the most minimal 3-month drug program. Would graduate, relapse, get busted, then graduate to Prop 36, which is more like a 12-month program. Same thing. I would stay clean throughout, maybe relapse here and there, but get around the testing system they had implemented, graduate, and then relapse again. The final time, I had finally gotten a job at the local community college as a certified pool operator. Yeah, I would go, on my lunch breaks, take the company vehicle off-site, get my drugs, get well, and keep it under the radar for as long as I could until finally, one of my dealers had convinced me and my girlfriend to like cash a check that wasn't his so we could get free dope. Got pulled over, was on probation, searched for me, found like a gram of heroin. Back in the jail system I go for a week, and that's when I ended up joining adult drug court, which is, for anyone that doesn't know, adult drug court, or ADC, is usually the most intense and strict drug program California can provide. It's for people with felonies, people with sales charges or gun charges, people who are looking at very heavy time. And they kind of accumulated my convictions over the past 5 years, mainly my 2 felony intent to distributes, and made them what's known as a floater on this drug program. So if I had graduated this program, I would have my felonies reduced to misdemeanors, and any misdemeanors not expunged, but taking off my official record. It was at that time, in that last jail term, I had met my good and best friend, Ryan, and we would end up creating our podcast, Nod Squad, and that kind of over time evolved throughout our drug court experience, and that has been a whole entirely different road I could talk about, where he would go through a relapse, I would go through a relapse, and we would kind of document and chronologicalize, our addiction and drug use over the airwaves for people to have a better understanding of what it's like living as an addict. But, halfway through our adult drug court program, my co-host Ryan had relapsed and had gone on the run. He finally, me and some friends had convinced him to turn himself into the courts, and he got sent to the inpatient where I'm at right now. He did 12 months down there, graduated, and was doing very good for himself. By that time, I had graduated drug court, went immediately back into relapse mode, and my life took a turn for much darker. I started overdosing, having to get hit with Narcan. One of my overdoses, I had to be injected with naloxone 4 times in a row to be brought back. And I was, foaming at the mouth, out cold for like 15 minutes, not breathing. It's pretty much a miracle I'm alive here talking today with you, and don't have like serious brain damage or I'm not dead. And I'd finally gotten in touch with a lot of people in the online recovery community that I've kind of immersed myself in for help. Dave from Dopey had reached out to me and convinced me to go into inpatient, as well as my friend Ryan, who basically said, we were utilizing the only tools we had at our disposal at the time, which was our drug use. But I needed to build an entirely new set of tools to be able to handle the outside world around me without feeling I needed to fall back on drugs to maintain all that. So finally, I was looking at 19 days of house arrest because of a drug DUI I had obtained throughout this time. I had gone back to LA, overdosed, and been hit with Narcan at some point during the story. And on my way back, I had crashed and totaled my car, fractured my ribs. And so now I had a drug DUI charge. I had completed the DUI classes, but every time I was about to go get an ankle monitor, I knew I wasn't going to be able to pass a drug test. And I knew that would lead me to being arrested again. So I would just keep extending the date. And finally, in my court hearing, I had just requested inpatient instead, a 12-month program in lieu of 19 days house arrest, because I knew I needed it. And that kind of, in short, has led me to be where I am now. I've been an inpatient for, 75 days now, and it's in a completely different experience from all the court-ordered drug programs I had done before. They have great results from what I've noticed. I had to do a lot of research at a lot of different state-sponsored facilities in California, and I've had the most positive feedback for where I'm at now. And I knew it was going to take more than a 90-day program for me to build a solid foundation to be able to handle the outside world, because it's probably one of the most difficult things for an addict in recovery is to intermingle with what we call normies, who are able to drink or smoke pot and not let it affect their lives the way we somehow allow it to spiral out of control. So that's kind of what I'm doing currently. This is the first time I've ever tried to work a 12-step program or have a serious sponsor and mentors around me that are helping me notice my character defects and not allow myself to get so isolated and stuck in my head where I feel like I have control over this myself, because this will always be something I need to recognize as being something beyond my own ability. So I guess in short, that's kind of where I'm at now currently, if that makes any sense.
It's kind of interesting that you kind of started off talking about how when you were younger, you started to become fear-based, or there were certain things that happened that resulted in a building up of fear, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then this kind of drug-related life story that you just outlined,
Uh-huh.
you could tell you just kind of like continuously fall further and further down the rabbit hole, right? You started with you started with weed and alcohol, went to pills, and that seemed manageable, at least in my mind's eye, for a little bit. And then it slowly devolved until you were literally overdosing and had to be given massive amounts of naloxone in order to revive you. What kept you from having fear that you were heading down this bad path? And I guess before you answer, like, I always worry about addiction myself. I enjoy substances on occasion. I kind of stay away from coke. I came across Adderall probably about a year ago and quickly realized that I liked that a little bit more than what I should. Like, it became it was a cautious sort of a thing for me. I was like, okay, this is something that I have to be aware of. And what I think kept me from allowing myself to devolve into hardcore addiction was a fear. It was a fear of becoming an addict and watching my life devolve. But from your story, it doesn't sound like you recognize that, or you didn't have much of a fear of that. Can you?
Yeah, definitely. I can elaborate on that more. Basically, I was so overwhelmed by, I think it was the fear of death, mainly because I've always been a control freak about all these different things in my life, and I would so desperately cling on to trying to control anything and everything in my life. And when I was diagnosed with cancer, that fear of dying too soon was always constantly in my head. I would even get a migraine and be fearful that, oh, is this a brain tumor? Like, is my cancer come back? Like, and then I would get fearful about that. So the fear base that I was controlled by, it was very bipolar, and that when I wasn't on drugs, I was allowing fear to control me and isolate me. You know how they say there's fight or flight syndrome? Well, I think that it's three. It's fight, flight, or freeze. And I would freeze up and I would get stuck in my head and just let my emotions and my thoughts just brew and stew in it until I found the only escape that I knew available to me, which was drugs. So I went basically from fearing everything, abusing opiates or intravenous drugs, and when I was under the influence of these drugs, I went to fear nothing. All my fears washed away. Now, that in turn at first was a good thing, because then I could go about living my life and going about my day without letting fears totally paralyze me. But then, because I was under the influence to such an extent and fearing nothing, I started to be fearless of things that I probably should be fearful of, like going to jail, dying, getting abscesses on my body, and just totally devolving and deteriorating into just a subhuman kind of life, if that makes any sense. So, like, it was like I justified so much of what I was doing because of the things that I had been exposed to. I would always, now that in, self-reflection, I realize, I was victimizing myself and blaming a lot of things happening to me on outside sources. It's like, well, it's not my fault I'm like this. It's the medical institutions that, screwed me over. And, it's all these corporations that have cancer-causing agents in their food and water or something, or it's the judicial system that fucked me over because they are the one that put felonies on my record. And I would blame all these horrible things and traumatic things that happened to me on outside sources, and then I would react towards them by and use that, my drug use and my drug abuse, as an excuse to go on this downward spiral. And at the time, I would justify it even further, because I was like, well, I'm just doing this to myself. I'm only abusing my own body. But now, in hindsight and being clean for these past couple of months, I realized I wasn't just an abuser of drugs. I was an abuser of relationships and family and friends and loved ones that were around me, just watching me slowly kill myself. And, it's a miracle that not only am I alive to tell this story today, but also that I didn't lose anything more than what I did. The last relapse I had, I saw coming from years away, which I didn't really touch on in my story, but after I'd graduated drug court, I was in and out of relapses, getting clean, relapsing, getting clean. And basically, even when I was in drug court and clean, I knew any red flag I was going to get, that I was going to have to bury my parents, or that my parents' health was slowly fading, I knew, if anything, would be the one thing to take me out, and that I would have to prepare myself for that, like we all have to one day. And, out of nowhere, I got hit with the news that my dad's heart complications were worsening. And I didn't know, how serious or not that was. My parents are, to this day, still kind of refuse to indulge me on the details of that, out of fear that how I would react to it. At the same time, my youngest sister had to have a forced-induced miscarriage. She was pregnant. The baby inside of her womb, its intestines, liver, and stomach were forming outside of its body. So she was having to go through constant testing and monitoring to see if the baby would survive childbirth, And it seemed about like every other test we would get back became worse and worse. So, the doctors would come back and say, oh, well, now we found out the baby has scoliosis in its spine and this and that, because, the child was, even if it had any chance of survival, it was going to have to go in immediate surgery after being born. And towards the end, they came to the conclusion that this baby was not going to survive childbirth, and she had to terminate her pregnancy. And, I checked out the best way I knew how, and slammed some heroin and meth. And then, I'd come clean to my girlfriend at the time, and she reacted horribly, became one of the nicest, most loving people to one of the most malicious people ever. And then I just used that as a justification to use more, like, oh, I'll show you, And it took, like you said, the rabbit hole took a nosedive. I ended up getting staph infection on my face, which was bizarre to me because I don't shoot up in my face. But I just looked like a hot mess. I was, letting some of the shadiest people use my car, and people would try to steal my car, or people were stealing from me. My own dope dealers were coming over, stealing, things from my house. The house I was staying with my parents basically. I had gotten my last check from my dispensary after I'd gotten released from jail, and it was like, over $10,000. I just gave it to them to kind of cover rent, and because I didn't trust myself with that money. So I was basically living rent free at that point. But at the same time, I'm letting all this dark elements of society come over and steal their Christmas presents. It was really horrible what I put my parents through. And I'm very lucky that they provided me with an intervention to say, look, you either go to treatment and then, get your life together, or you're just going to have to move out on your own anyway. And so, I had a great job offer at the time as like a head of the meat department of like a butcher department at a grocery store. I had to turn that down. I had to turn down a lot of opportunities to focus on myself, because I knew it wasn't going to do me any good if I was just going to constantly relapse and go back to just drug use, because like we were talking about before, that whole situation in itself was fear-based. I had a fear of losing my parents and not knowing how to live on my own independently. I had a fear of what my family members were going through, and I didn't know how to console or confide with them and be supportive with them. And, I didn't know how to handle all this rejection. And now I'm realizing, I have codependency issues. I have abandonment issues. I react to negative situations in the worst way possible. And all of that kind of ties back to fear, but it also ties back to pride and ego. The recovery process is still so very foreign and new to me. But like I said, I'm 2 months into a 12-month program. I've only begun to scratch the surface of what is going on inside of me, and picking up and fixing the broken pieces that is like me, So it's just been a very, very strange, surreal like experience. I spent so much of my life not stepping outside of my comfort zone that safe space became the most uncomfortable place to be in. So even stepping outside of my comfort zone, as uncomfortable as it may be, to learn all this about myself and admit my wrongdoings to others, it's still much better than where I was in my darkest depths of my addiction. You know what I'm saying?
So you had said you're 75 days in. Was that correct?
Yes.
Would it be safe to say that you're not out of the woods yet?
No, not at all. My co-host and best friend of my podcast, he graduated, and 3 months into being immersed into society again, he had gone back out and relapsed himself. So I'm having to try and be there and support him just recently, and he was like the poster child of this program that I'm in now. So I'm by no means cured, and I have a long road ahead of me, and at least I'm self-aware of that. But it's like, I'm going to have to work on this underlying issue of me for the rest of my life. I know now, it's kind of known like what's going to be required of me. I'm going to have to attend meetings for the rest of my life, talk to a sponsor, or reach out to people in recovery for the rest of my life. I'm going to have to work the 12-step program on a daily basis. It's not like, oh, you do step 1 and now you're done. It's like you complete step 1 and you have to work that as much as possible on a daily basis. And then once you get to step 2, now you're doing both those steps every day. So at least now I'm kind of learning the tools of how to integrate and live as a contributing member of society. But by no means, I could graduate this program, or even if I don't graduate this program, but so far I'm doing good enough to where when I graduate this program, I'm by no means going to be able to say, oh, I can go back out and live as a normal person does. Addiction isn't it's not something I can just say, okay, I'm good now. I have to completely change everything about who I once was. And that is a tall order for anybody, and especially an addict, you know? So what my plan is to, once I graduate this 12-month program, is to transfer or transition into sober living for at least 6 months, hopefully a little longer, while I'm still kind of learning how to navigate through all, the elements of, our society, because you see alcohol ads all around you. I mean, I'm going to be transferring to UC Santa Barbara, hopefully, and the college element is going to be there, and being around the culture of that's going to be a challenge for me. And then even just learning how to not get involved into toxic relationships is going to be a learning experience for me as well. So I by no means am out of it right now. This is going to be a struggle I have to deal with for the rest of my life, and I'm just as susceptible as relapsing and going back out as anyone else is out there. I'm no better than anybody out there listening. It's like I have just as much problems as anyone else has to face, but at the same time, we all have an equal level playing field where we all have the possibility to succeed and get through this and maintain a clean and sober lifestyle. But we're all just as susceptible to reverting back to our old character defects and going back and abusing drugs and letting them take us out, And I don't say that to discourage people, we all have that ability to do great things, but we all also have the ability to do horrible things, So it's up to the individual to decide whether or not they're ready to make the changes and take that long road ahead of them. That won't be fun. It won't be comfortable by any means, but it's possible. They say in meetings, the road to AA and NA is built on the bones of fallen addicts, but it's not the blind leading the blind. It's like we're leading each other through this because other people have made it out to the other side. So, a better life is possible and is out there for anybody who's willing to take it. But we can't, people can't force you through it or pull at your hand and pull you out of the fire. They can only show you the road and point you in the right direction, but you have to walk down it yourself. And I communicate with addicts online on a regular basis who are struggling, and they hear my story on my podcast. And I think because I'm so open and honest about my experiences and lay it out on the table, a lot of people feel comfortable approaching me and letting me know about what's going on in their life. And I'm completely open to help any and everyone out there as much as possible. I mean, my internet access is semi-limited because I'm not allowed a phone here. I have to go to the library to access internet. But I try to be of service to as many people as possible because, a lot of these people may not realize it, but that helps me stay sober. It helps me get out of my own head and focus on anything other than myself, if that makes sense. So anyone who wants to reach out to me, they know where to find me. Our email is nodsquadpodcast@gmail.com. Anyone who's feeling like they're struggling through what they're going through, that by all means, I'm willing to talk to them, and because I'm going along through it right along with you. We're all in this together. So.
This episode was produced by me, Phillip Johnson. All songs used can be found in the description section of this episode. If you liked what you heard today, please subscribe. Also, rate and leave a review on iTunes. It goes a really, really long way. If you'd like to become a patron of Psychotropic, or if you'd like to check out some psychotropic related swag, or if you have a story to share, You can do all of this at psychotropicpodcast.com. If you're interested in getting a better idea about upcoming episodes, be sure to follow Psychotropic on Instagram at psychotropicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening, everybody. See you next time.